Chapter 1. Introduction. Who were the Germanic tribes? The Germanic tribes belong to those peoples of antiquity and the early Middle Ages who have particularly shaped the imagination and the historical image of Europe. They appear in the sources as fierce fighters, as freedom lovers, as opponents of the Roman Empire, and finally as pioneers of medieval Europe. But who the Germanic tribes really were cannot be explained in a few words. Rather, it is a collective term that encompasses a multitude of different tribes, cultures, and languages that have changed their face again and again over the centuries. The term Germans does not come from the tribes themselves, but was coined from outside, especially by the Romans. They used it to describe a large group of peoples north of the Alps, east of the Rhine, and north of the Danube. Tacitus, Caesar, and other ancient authors saw in them a unity, although they were in fact numerous tribes that were often at odds with each other, cultivated different traditions, and never saw themselves as one people. So the name was more of a collective term than a self-definition. The Germanic tribes did not appear in history as a uniform cultural area from the beginning. Rather, they were part of the Indo-European language and cultural family that spread across Europe and Asia over thousands of years. Its origins probably lie in the area between the Elbe, Rhine, Oder, and Vistula. From there, they began to spread in various waves across Central and Northern Europe. What distinguished the Germanic tribes compared to their neighbors, such as the Celts or Romans, was not a highly developed urban culture or monumental buildings, but a strong tribal organization, a rural way of life, and an extraordinary warrior culture. They lived in small village communities, engaged in agriculture and livestock breeding, and were at the same time excellent fighters, whose courage and tenacity impressed even the Romans. At the same time, the Germanic tribes should not only be thought of as wild barbarians. They had a differentiated religion with a rich world of gods, a strong sense of justice, and their own forms of art and crafts. Their myths, rituals, and concept of freedom not only shaped their own culture, but also later influenced medieval societies that emerged from Germanic tribes. In European history, the Germanic tribes play a double role. On the one hand, they were the others, the opponents, the threat to the Roman Empire. On the other hand, they were part of the transformation that brought antiquity into the Middle Ages. Without the Germanic tribes, the great migrations of peoples, the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, and the emergence of new kingdoms in Europe would hardly have been conceivable. This script aims to trace the history of the Germanic tribes in all its diversity, from their origins in prehistoric times to their encounters with Rome to the great migrations and the formation of new empires. It is not only about battles and conquests, but also about religion, society, language, and aftermath. Because the Germanic tribes are more than just a military phenomenon. They are part of the roots of Europe. Chapter 2. Origins and Early Settlement Areas. The origins of the Germanic tribes go far back into prehistory and are closely linked to the great migratory movements of the Indo-European language family. Archaeological finds and linguistic comparisons indicate that the Germanic tribes had their roots in an area between the southern Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and the rivers Elbe, Oder, and Vistula. This heartland is considered the cradle of the Germanic peoples, from which they spread in different directions over centuries. In the Bronze Age, from about 2000 BC, settlements were established in Northern Europe that already showed a certain cultural independence. The so-called Nordic Bronze Age produced a wealth of finds, artistically crafted bronze swords, jewelry, chariot models, and cult objects. Particularly striking are the large rock carvings in Scandinavia, which show scenes of warriors, ships, and religious rituals. These finds prove that the people in this region developed an independent culture early on, which differed from their neighbors to the south. The environmental conditions played a decisive role in this. The Germanic settlement areas were characterized by forests, moors, and rivers. Farming was possible but arduous, and often one had to feed oneself additionally by raising cattle, hunting, and gathering. This meant that societies were organized on a small scale and did not produce large cities or centralized empires. Instead, people lived in scattered villages led by tribal leaders or chiefs. In the Iron Age, from about 500 BC, the cultural peculiarity of the Germanic tribes intensified. With the processing of iron, they received a material that made their weapons and tools more powerful. Iron was more accessible than bronze, so it could be used more widely. The transition to the Iron Age therefore marked an important step in the development of the Germanic tribes. Linguistically, the Germanic tribes can be defined more clearly from this time onwards. The Germanic language group developed from the Indo-European language stem and split into different dialects, which later led to the North Germanic, West Germanic, and East Germanic languages. This early diversity alone shows that the Germanic tribes were not a unified people, but a group of related tribes with similar language and culture. Contacts with neighboring peoples also played a role in the development. In the West, the Germanic tribes bordered on the Celts, who were role models and competitors at the same time with their powerful tribal associations and rich cultures. In the South, they later came across the Romans, whom they initially saw as savage barbarians, but at the same time learned from them. In the East, they were in contact with Slavic groups and steppe peoples. These encounters led to exchanges, conflicts, and migration movements that shaped the history of the Germanic peoples. The early settlement areas of the Germanic tribes can be roughly outlined as follows. In the north, their habitat extended over Denmark and southern Scandinavia. In the south, to about the Elbe, and later to the Rhine and the Danube. In the east, to the Vistula. This area was not a closed empire, but a patchwork of tribes that were loosely connected and in constant motion. Thus, small peasant communities grew into a culture held together by their language, their social organization, and their martial tradition. These early foundations formed the starting point for those historical developments that would later make the Germanic tribes a decisive force in Europe. Chapter 3: Language and Tribal Structures. The language of the Germanic tribes is one of the keys to understanding their cultural identity. Even though there are no written testimonies from the early period, essential features can be identified through linguistic reconstructions and later traditions. The Germanic languages developed from the original Indo-European tribe and formed their own language group from about 500 BC, which differed significantly from the Celtic, Italic, and Slavic neighbors. A decisive linguistic feature is the so-called Germanic sound shift, often referred to as the first sound shift. It changed certain sounds compared to other Indo-European languages. For example, the Indo-European P became a Germanic F, as in Latin pater, German father, or T became a th, Latin tres, English three. This development marked the demarcation of the Germanic language family and led to the development of its own dialects. Within the Germanic language group, three major branches soon differed. West Germanic. This includes the later languages German, English, Dutch, and Frisian. North Germanic. This gave rise to the Scandinavian languages, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroese. East Germanic. This branch is extinct today, but languages such as Gothic have been handed down through texts, such as the Gothic translation of the Bible by Wulfila in the 4th century. The language was therefore not uniform, but reflected the diversity of the tribes. Nevertheless, there were enough similarities to create a certain sense of cultural togetherness. The tribal structure of the Germanic tribes was just as diverse as the language. The Germanic tribes did not know a centralized form of government in the Roman sense. Instead, they lived in tribal associations made up of several clans. The clan was the basic social unit, a community of relatives who shared land, livestock, and rights. At the head of a tribe was often a chief or king, but he did not have unlimited power. His authority was based on prestige, bravery in battle, and the ability to build consensus among tribesmen. Many decisions were made in the Thing Assembly, a kind of people's assembly where free men deliberated on law, war, and peace. This principle of communal decision-making shows that the Germanic tribes had a strong sense of freedom and that rule was always dependent on consent and recognition. The Germanic tribes differed in size and importance. Some remained small and localized. Others grew into large associations that played an important role in history. Among the most famous are the Cherusci, who became famous for Arminius and the Battle of Varus, the Suebi, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, the Burgundians, and the Saxons. Each of these tribes had its own traditions, leaders, and settlement areas, but they all belonged to the great Germanic family of peoples. The tribal society of the Germanic tribes was closely linked to their warrior culture. A leader's retinue consisted of warriors who swore allegiance to him in exchange for booty, protection, and prestige. These followers formed the core of political power. A successful leader was the one who could gather many warriors around him and achieve victories with them. The language and tribal structures of the Germanic tribes thus show two things. On the one hand, diversity and fragmentation, and on the other hand, commonalities that distinguished them from their neighbors. They were not a people in the modern sense, but a cultural community connected by language, social organization, and a common way of life. These foundations shaped their self-image and determined their role in the ancient world. Chapter 4. Religion and the World of the Gods. The religion of the Germanic tribes was more than just a collection of myths. It was the mirror of their worldview, their society, and their daily life. For the Germanic tribes, the world was permeated by gods, spirits, and forces of fate, which were active in natural phenomena, in war, in law, and in the seasons. Her world of gods was diverse and changeable, and many of her ideas later lived on in Norse mythology as handed down in the Eddas. At the center of the Germanic religion was a multitude of gods, each representing certain areas of life. Among the most important were Woden, Odin. He was the highest god, ruler of war, wisdom, and magic. He searched for knowledge, sacrificed his eye to gain wisdom, and hung from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to discover the runes. For many warriors, he was the god who decided on victory or defeat. Donar, Thor. The god of thunder was one of the most popular gods, protector of man and the world against the forces of chaos. With his hammer Mjolnir, he fought against giants and monsters. It was a symbol of strength, fertility, and protection. Tiwaz, Tyr, an ancient god of war who stood for justice, loyalty to treaties, and courage. In Norse lore, he sacrificed his hand to bind the monster Fenrir. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. She stood for magic and wealth at the same time and was considered one of the most powerful goddesses. Frigg, wife of Odin, guardian of marriage and motherhood. She was described as wise and forward-looking. In addition to these main deities, there were countless other beings, giants, dwarves, nature spirits, and ancestors who were revered and feared. The Germanic religion was polytheistic and at the same time strongly connected to nature. Rivers, trees, and stones could be sacred. Trees in particular played a central role as they were considered mediators between the worlds. The Germanic tribes imagined the world as a network of planes held together in the world tree Yggdrasil. Beneath its roots lay the realms of the dead, in its branches the heavens of the gods. This image of a cosmic order shaped their understanding of the world. Fate was also a fixed factor for them. The Norns, mysterious women of fate, determined the life of every human being and also of the gods themselves. An important element of religion was rituals and sacrifices. The Germanic tribes believed that the gods could be appeased or supported by sacrifices. These could be animals, but human sacrifices are also documented in some sources, especially in times of great need or before important battles. Sacred groves, moors, and springs were places of such rituals. Archaeological finds of sacrificed weapons, jewelry, and even entire ships prove these practices. Religion was closely linked to warriorism. Fallen warriors hoped to be admitted to the halls of the gods. In later Norse myth, this was Valhalla, where they trained until the final battle, the Ragnarok. This image of heroic death was a central component of the Germanic self-image. But religion was not only a matter for the warriors. It also played a role in everyday life, in agriculture, in birth, marriage, and death. Spells, runes, and divinations were widespread. There were no priests in the narrower sense. Instead, tribal leaders or priestesses took over the religious acts. Women often had a special position in religious matters as they were credited with access to prophetic powers. The Germanic religion was therefore a religion of life that encompassed the whole of existence. It explained nature, strengthened the community, legitimized rule, and gave hope in the face of death. Even though it was pushed back in the course of Christianization, much of it lives on in myths, fairy tales, and symbols to this day.
Chapter 5. Society, Law, and Everyday Life. The life of the Germanic tribes was strongly influenced by nature, the seasons, and the tribal order. Unlike the Romans, who lived in cities and developed a complex administrative system, Germanic society was more rural, decentralized, and tribal-oriented. But even without cities and written laws, the Germanic tribes had clear social structures, rules, and traditions that determined their lives. At the top of society were the nobles and tribal leaders, often from families with a long tradition. They were distinguished by wealth, prestige, and military successes. However, their power was not absolute. They relied on the consent of their followers and free men. Their influence was based on their ability to rally warriors around them and gain the trust of the community. The free men, who formed the core of Germanic society, played a central role. They were farmers, craftsmen, or warriors who had their own rights and duties. Only free men were allowed to participate in the Thing meetings, where law, war, and peace were decided. These popular assemblies were both court and deliberative bodies and were considered a symbol of the Germanic people's sense of freedom. In addition to the free, there were the semi-free and the unfree. Semi-free people were often serfs or people who had become dependent. They stood between freedom and servitude. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were the slaves, who could find themselves in this situation through captivity or debt. Even if they had no rights, they were important in the economy, for example in agriculture or as servants. The legal system of the Germanic tribes was not based on written laws, but on customary law. Traditions, and the judgment of the Thing congregation determined what was right. The idea of the clan was important. Crimes or disputes did not only affect individuals, but entire family groups. If someone was murdered, it was the task of the clan to take revenge or demand reparation. A typical means of conflict resolution was the payment of wehrgeld, a fixed amount of compensation that reflected the value of a person. This avoided blood feuds and kept peace between the clans. These regulations show that Germanic society, despite its warlike reputation, was strongly concerned with balance and community. The everyday life of the Germanic tribes was determined by the rhythm of agriculture. They grew grain, especially barley, rye, and oats, kept livestock such as cattle, pigs, and sheep, and lived in simple wooden houses, which were often both residential and stable buildings. Life was hard, the winters long, and crop failures could quickly trigger famines. Women play a central role in everyday life. They ran the household, took care of children, animals, and field work, and produced clothing and food. Sources such as Tacitus report that Germanic women had a respected position not only in the home but also in public life. They were considered advisors, could make prophecies, and were involved in religious rituals. Hospitality was also a high priority for the Germanic tribes. Travelers and strangers were welcomed and entertained, which meant both honor and duty. Festivals, drinking bouts, and joint sacrifices strengthened the sense of community and bound the tribes closer together. Germanic society was therefore not a loose coexistence of warriors, but a clearly structured community held together by tradition, law, and tribal organization. Their everyday life was simple and marked by hard work, but at the same time by rituals, festivals, and a strong sense of cohesion.
Chapter 6.
Warrior culture and weapons. The Germanic tribes were often described by their neighbors, especially the Romans, as a warlike people. Tacitus, Caesar, and other Roman authors highlighted the bravery, ferocity, and determination of Germanic warriors. This assessment was not only Roman propaganda, but actually reflected a basic pillar of Germanic society, the warrior culture. Being a warrior did not mean going to war alone. It was a way of life that defined honor, prestige, and social position. For young men, joining the warrior community was an important step into adult life. A man who did not carry weapons or did not prove himself in battle was considered dishonorable. Weapons were not only tools of war, but also symbols of freedom and belonging. The Germanic warriors usually fought in retinues that gathered around a chief or leader. These allegiances were bound together by an oath of allegiance and mutual obligation. The warrior owed obedience and bravery to his master, while the leader granted booty, glory, and protection. This close bond between lord and followers was a central political and social factor in the Germanic world. The weapons of the Germanic tribes were comparatively simple but effective. The most important symbol was the spear, often referred to as phromaia. It was easy to make, versatile, and could serve as both a thrusting and throwing weapon. Many warriors possessed several spears that they used in melee or ranged combat. In addition, swords played a major role, but they were rarer and more valuable. A sword was not just a weapon, but a status symbol. Swords were often passed down through generations, decorated with runes or artistically forged. Double-edged swords in particular were considered noble and were carried by wealthier warriors. Axes and clubs were also used, while the bow was less common among the Germanic tribes than among other peoples. Protection was provided by shields, usually round or oval, made of wood and often reinforced with a metal hump. Helmets and armor, on the other hand, were rare. Only leaders or particularly rich warriors could afford bronze or iron helmets and chainmail. The majority of the warriors went into battle only with shields and light armament. The fighting style of the Germanic tribes differed from the Roman discipline. They relied on speed, surprise, and courage. They often formed a shield wall, where the fighters lined up closely together and connected their shields to form a closed front. From this formation, they could attack with spears or harass the enemy. They often opened battles with loud battle cries intended to intimidate their enemies. Another important aspect of warrior culture was honor. Glory in battle was of paramount importance, and death on the battlefield was considered more honorable than a life of cowardice. This ideal was deeply linked to religion. Warriors who died bravely hoped to be inducted into the halls of the gods. The Germanic tribes fought not only against external enemies such as Romans or Celts, but also often against each other. Tribal feuds, raids, and internal power struggles were part of everyday life. Wars were not only political disputes, but also a means of gaining wealth, preserving honor, and strengthening the cohesion of the followers. The Roman authors admired and feared the Germanic warrior culture at the same time. On the one hand, they saw in it a crude wildness, and on the other hand, a virtue that had become increasingly alien to the Romans. For the Germanic tribes themselves, the warrior class was the heart of their society. It combined religion, politics, and culture into an ideal of life that determined their history for centuries.
Chapter 7. Trade and Economy. As much as the Germanic tribes were described by Roman authors as fierce warriors and barbarians, their everyday life was also shaped by economic activities. They would not have been able to survive without agriculture, crafts, and trade, and archaeological finds show that their economic structures were more diverse and organized than was long assumed. The basis of the Germanic economy was agriculture. The majority of the population lived from agriculture and animal husbandry. Cereals such as barley, oats, millet, and later rye were cultivated, which proved particularly effective in the northern climate. Bread and porridge were staple foods, supplemented by meat, dairy products, and vegetables. Livestock farming played a central role. Cattle were considered a sign of wealth and prestige. Sheep provided wool, goats milk, and pigs were an important source of meat. Horses served not only as mounts, but also as cult-revered animals. In addition to agriculture, crafts also developed. Germanic blacksmiths made weapons, tools, and jewelry, which were often artistically decorated. Working with iron was particularly important, as iron was used not only for weapons, but also for plowshares, axes, and knives. The processing of bone, wood, and horn was also widespread. Textiles made of wool and linen were made, with women playing an important role in spinning and weaving. Trade was an important link to the outside world for the Germanic tribes. Early on, they came into contact with the Celts, whose rich culture influenced them. Later, the Romans became their most important trading partners. A lively exchange developed on the borders of the Roman Empire. The Germanic tribes supplied raw materials such as amber, furs, honey, wax, cattle, and slaves, while in return, they received Roman goods, wine, glass vessels, ceramics, jewelry, coins, and weapons. Amber, which was found in large quantities on the coasts of the Baltic Sea, was particularly sought after and was exported as far as the Mediterranean. Archaeological finds of Roman coins in Germanic areas prove the intensity of this trade. Even though the Germanic tribes themselves did not develop coinage for a long time, they used Roman denarii as jewelry, or stamps. This exchange led to the appearance of Roman luxury goods in Germanic settlements, which in turn increased the prestige of their owners. The Germanic economy was not dependent on markets in the modern sense, but was based on barter and natural economy. Within the clans, food, tools, and services were exchanged. Wealth was measured less in coins than in cattle, land, or weapons. Nevertheless, through contact with Rome, an awareness of super-regional trade structures developed. The sea also played an important role. The tribes on the North Sea and Baltic Sea in particular used ships for trade and raids. They were skilled seafarers who not only connected coastal regions, but also used extensive trade routes across rivers and sea. Even before the Vikings, the Germanic tribes laid the foundations for a maritime culture. Economy and trade also had political significance. Leaders who controlled access to coveted trade goods were able to strengthen their followers and expand their influence. At the same time, the wealth from trade with Rome led to tensions. While some tribes worked closely with the Romans and benefited from their luxury, others held on to independence and enmity. In summary, it can be said that the Germanic tribes were not only warriors, but also farmers, craftsmen, and traders. Its economy was characterized by self-sufficiency, barter, and exchange with its neighbors, with Rome playing a central role. This contact brought prosperity, but also conflicts, an area of tension that had a lasting impact on their history.
Chapter 8. Encounters with Celts and Romans. The history of the Germanic tribes is hardly imaginable without the encounters with their neighbors, especially the Celts and Romans. These contacts not only shaped the image of the Germanic tribes in the written sources, but also influenced their cultural and economic development. While the Celts were an adversary and at the same time a cultural driving force, especially in the early centuries, the Roman Empire became the decisive power factor on which the fate of the Germanic tribes was decided for centuries. The Celts had been widespread in large parts of Europe since the early Iron Age. Their highly developed culture, with cities, oppida, elaborate metalwork, and extensive trade networks, impressed the Germanic neighbors. Germanic tribes and Celts were in close contact, which included both peaceful trade and bloody conflicts. Archaeological finds show that Germanic tribes adopted Celtic forms of jewelry, weapons, and ceramics. At the same time, Germanic groups advanced into Celtic territories with increasing population pressure, which led to conflicts. Some researchers see this pressure as a reason for the great migrations of the Cimbri and Teutones, who later also challenged Rome. The encounter with the Romans initially began indirectly through trade, but quickly turned into a direct confrontation. Julius Caesar was the first Roman general to specifically mention Germanic tribes in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico in the 1st century BC. For him, the Germanic tribes were wild, uncivilized warriors who streamed over from the other side of the Rhine and threatened the Roman provinces. Caesar used the danger posed by the Germanic tribes to legitimize his own campaigns in Gaul. The Romans saw the Rhine and later also the Danube as a natural border between their civilized world and barbaric Germania. But this limit was never absolute. There were repeated military campaigns, raids, and also alliances. Some Germanic tribes, such as the Euboeans, even settled on Roman soil and became allies. Others, such as the Chersonesi, put up fierce resistance. The encounter between Romans and Germanic tribes was marked by ambivalence. On the one hand, there was enmity, battles, and mutual raids. On the other hand, there was a lively exchange. Germanic tribes served as mercenaries in the Roman army, received Roman weapons, and learned about military tactics. Conversely, the Romans took over Germanic soldiers as auxiliary troops who became famous for their bravery. For the Romans, the Germanic tribes were a constant factor of uncertainty. Despite major campaigns, they never succeeded in conquering the Germanic heartland permanently. The defeat of Varus in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD marked a turning point. From then on, Rome refrained from a comprehensive conquest and concentrated on securing the borders. The limes facilities on the Rhine and Danube became symbols of this border policy. For the Germanic tribes themselves, the contacts with Rome meant a deep cut. They gained access to Roman wealth and luxury, but also to military pressure and threats. Some tribes sought the proximity of Rome and profited from trade. Others opposed the superior force and defended their freedom. This tension between adaptation and resistance shaped its history for centuries. Thus, the encounters of the Germanic tribes with Celts and Romans can be understood as an interplay of influence, conflict, and exchange. They were a decisive engine for the development of Germanic culture, and they paved the way for the great events in which the Germanic tribes became the focus of world history.
Chapter 9. The Cimbri and Teutones. Among all the encounters between Germans and Romans, the events surrounding the Cimbri and Teutones stand out in particular. They mark the first major appearance of Germanic tribes on the stage of ancient world history and showed Rome that the threat from the north should not be underestimated. The Cimbri and Teutones were tribes that originally came from the area of present-day Jutland, Denmark. Climatic changes, population pressure, or political conflicts probably forced them to leave their homeland. Around 120 BC, they began a tremendous migration that took them across Central Europe to Gaul and finally even to Italy. This movement is considered one of the first great migrations of Germanic tribes. First, they advanced into the Danube region and met Celtic and Roman forces there. Soon, this migration developed into a veritable migration of peoples, as the Cimbri and Teutones were joined by other tribes. Their migration did not have the character of an organized campaign, but was rather the movement of an entire people. Men, women, children, wagons, and cattle moved together, always in search of new settlement areas. The Romans initially met this movement with skepticism, later with growing fear. Around 113 BC, the first major battle took place near Nerea in Noricum, today's Austria, in which the Cimbri and their allies defeated a Roman army. This shock was deep because the Romans were used to wrestling down their opponents even in the distance, but now they were defeated in the immediate vicinity of their empire. In the following years, the Romans suffered several defeats, including in 105 BC at Arezzo, now Orange in southern France. There, a Roman force of up to 80,000 men was destroyed, one of the heaviest defeats in the entire Roman military history. Rome was on the verge of panic because it was feared that the barbarians could soon invade Italy and threaten the city itself. The threat was so serious that Rome appointed one of its greatest generals, Gaius Marius. He carried out a profound reform of the Roman army by creating a professional army that no longer consisted only of propertied citizens, but also included poorer classes. This reform made the Roman army more powerful and flexible, and it laid the foundation for what would later become Roman military power. Marius finally succeeded in defeating the Cimbrian Teutones in two major battles. In 102 BC, he defeated the Teutones at Aquae Sextia, now Aix-en-Provence. A year later, in 101 BC, the decisive battle against the Cimbri at Vercellae in northern Italy followed. Both tribes were destroyed, their survivors enslaved, and the threat to Rome was averted. But the memory of the Cimbrian Teutones remained. For the Romans, they were a horrific image that showed what could happen when entire peoples were set in motion. For the Germanic tribes themselves, this move was an early example of the fact that their tribes not only possessed regional power, but had the potential to enter the great stream of world history. The events surrounding the Cimbrian Teutones thus had a double meaning. They shaped the Roman military reform and created an early image of the dangerous Germanic peoples. At the same time, they were at the beginning of the migrations of peoples that centuries later were to fundamentally change the face of Europe. Chapter 10. Arminius and the Battle of Varus. If one is looking for an event that still shapes the image of the Germanic tribes in European memory today, it is the Battle of Varus in 9 AD. Hardly any other chapter of Germanic history has had such an effect, because it symbolized the triumph of the barbarians over the all-powerful Roman civilization. At the center of this drama is the figure of Arminius, who has been stylized as a national hero and freedom fighter, even if his life shows a more complex picture. Arminius came from the tribe of the Cherusci, who settled in the area between the Weser and the Elbe. As a young man, he had come to Rome as a hostage, a common practice to secure the loyalty of Germanic leaders. There, he received military training, Roman citizenship, and the rank of knight. He even served as an officer in the Roman army. Arminius was therefore very familiar with Roman warfare and understood the strengths as well as the weaknesses of his opponents. When he returned to his homeland, he found a divided country. Many Germanic tribes had allied themselves with Rome and were under the rule of the governor Publius Quintilius Varus. Varus was an experienced politician, but not a good general. He tried to organize Germanic territory according to the Roman model, to levy taxes and to establish a province, Germania Magna. This approach met with growing resistance because the Germanic tribes perceived Roman rule as a threat to their freedom. Arminius succeeded in uniting different tribes into an alliance, a great achievement, as the Germanic tribes were often at odds. He planned an ambush that would go down in history. In 9 AD, Varus led 3 legions of about 20,000 men deep into Germanic territory, probably to put down an uprising. Arminius apparently accompanied him as an ally, while in reality he was preparing the trap. In the forests of the Teutoburg region, an impassable area with swamps, hills, and dense forest, the Germanic tribes struck. For several days, they attacked the Roman troops, who could only move through the terrain with difficulty. The legionnaires, accustomed to open battlefields, were at a clear disadvantage in the narrow paths and swamps. The Germanic tribes knew the terrain and used it skillfully. Eventually, the Roman legions were completely wiped out. Varus committed suicide, and the Roman military signs fell into Germanic hands. The defeat was a shock of enormous significance for Rome. 3 legions, a tenth of the entire Roman army, were wiped out. Emperor Augustus is said to have exclaimed in despair, "Varus, give me back my legions." Roman expansion beyond the Rhine was stopped for a long time. Although later generals such as Germanicus undertook retaliatory campaigns and won open battles, a lasting conquest of Germania failed. The Rhine and the Danube remained the borders of the empire. For the Germanic tribes, the Battle of Varus was a symbol of their desire for freedom. But the agreement did not last long. Soon the alliances fell apart, and Arminius himself was murdered by relatives. His dream of a united Germania remained unfulfilled. The aftermath of the Battle of Varus is enormous. In the Roman world, it marked a turning point in the expansionist policy, and in European memory, it was later glorified as the victory of the free peoples over Roman foreign rule. In the 19th century, Arminius, now known as Hermann the Cheruscan, was stylized as a national hero and symbol of the German struggle for freedom. The Hermann Monument near Detmold still bears witness to this interpretation today. Historically, the Battle of Varus was not the end of Roman power in the north, but it was the end of the dream of a province of Germania. For the Germanic tribes, it was not so much the beginning of unity as a brief moment of unity, but its symbolic value extends far beyond antiquity. It became a myth that continues to have an impact today.
Chapter 11. Germanic Tribes in the Roman Army. The relationship between Germanic tribes and Romans was not only characterized by enmity and battles, but also by close cooperation, especially in the military field. Although the Germanic tribes often appeared as opponents, many of them also served as soldiers in the Roman army. This dual role illustrates the complex connection between the two cultures. Since Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, the Romans used Germanic warriors as auxiliary troops. Rome was an empire that relied on a huge army, and it could not fill its legions with Roman citizens alone. For this reason, so-called auxiliary troops were used, soldiers from the provinces or from allied peoples. For the Germanic tribes, this service was attractive because it promised booty, pay, and prestige. Germanic warriors were considered particularly brave, fierce, and fearless. The Romans often used them where courage and determination were required, in the vanguard, in dangerous attacks, or as cavalry. The Germanic cavalry in particular was feared, as it was mobile and powerful. Some tribes, such as the Batavians from present-day Holland, became famous for their role in the Roman army. They provided elite units that were deployed in campaigns in Britain, the East, or Africa. For the Germanic tribes themselves, service in the Roman army had many advantages. It brought not only wealth, but also access to Roman weapons, equipment, and military knowledge. Men like Arminius, who was in Roman service before fighting Rome, show how dangerous this union could be. Those who knew Roman tactics could later use them against Rome. In the course of time, the integration of the Germanic tribes into the Roman army became ever closer. Many of them received Roman citizenship after their service, an honor that benefited not only them, but often their families as well. Entire Germanic tribes settled in the Roman Empire and provided soldiers for the army. This development led to the boundaries between Romans and Germanic tribes becoming increasingly blurred. Especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when the Roman Empire was under strong pressure, Germanic warriors became indispensable. Many of them rose to high ranks and held command posts. Some even became kingmakers, as they had large military followings. In the late empire, quite a few Germanic tribes served as generals, and some, such as Odoacer, the last Western Roman emperor deposed in 476, went down in history as rulers themselves. But this integration also had its downsides. While Germanic warriors fought in the Roman army, other tribes pushed to the borders of the empire at the same time. Sometimes, the same warriors changed sides when they no longer felt they were treated fairly by Rome. Allies could quickly become enemies, which further weakened the empire. The Germanic tribes in the Roman army are an example of the mutual interpenetration of two worlds. Opponents became soldiers, barbarians became Roman citizens, and auxiliary troops sometimes became the gravediggers of the empire. Without Germanic soldiers, Rome would hardly have been able to hold its borders for so long. But it was precisely this dependence that ultimately contributed to the fact that the Roman Empire was Germanized from within. Chapter 12. The Marcomannic Wars. In the 2nd century A.D., the Roman Empire once again reached the limits of its stability. Under the long reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, a series of serious conflicts broke out on the Danube border, which became known as the Marcomannic Wars. These wars were not only of great military importance, but also an early sign of the growing dynamism of the Germanic tribes, which were increasingly asserting themselves against Rome. The Marcomanni were a West Germanic tribe that originally lived in the area between the Main and Elbe rivers. Under their king Marbod, they had already developed into a powerful tribal confederation in the 1st century AD, and later settled in the area of today's Bohemia. Together with the Quadi and other neighboring tribes, they formed a strong alliance that put increasing pressure on Rome. The causes of the wars were manifold. On the one hand, population growth in the Germanic region led to pressure to the south, where more fertile soils and rich Roman provinces beckoned. On the other hand, the prospect of loot was tempting, because the Roman Empire offered a worthwhile destination with its cities, estates, and trade routes. In addition, internal tensions and power struggles among the tribes repeatedly led to attacks on Rome, which were seen as an opportunity to gain wealth and prestige. Between 166 and 180 AD, there were a number of incursions by Germanic tribes across the Danube. Particularly dramatic was an attack in which Germanic warriors advanced as far as northern Italy and even threatened Aquileia, an important city in northeastern Italy. Rome was forced to massively strengthen its armies on the Danube. Marcus Aurelius, known as the Philosopher Emperor, spent most of his reign not in Rome but at the front. There, he personally led the battles against the Marcomanni, Quadi, Vandals, and other tribes. The wars were bitter and dragged on for years, often interrupted by armistices, which were soon broken. Particularly serious was the fact that the fighting was accompanied by a plague that was carried into the empire by returning soldiers, presumably the so-called Antonine Plague, which severely weakened the Roman Empire and claimed millions of victims. This made military efforts even more difficult and led to a general crisis. Despite all the difficulties, Marcus Aurelius succeeded in pushing back the Germanic tribes. In several campaigns, he himself crossed the Danube and fought deep in barbarian territory. His goal was to permanently subjugate the Marcomannis and Quadi and to establish new provinces there. But his death in 180 prevented the final implementation of these plans. The Marcomannic Wars had far-reaching consequences. On the one hand, they showed that the Germanic tribes were capable of coordinated attacks that could threaten the heart of the empire. On the other hand, they highlighted the vulnerability of Rome and the enormous effort that was necessary to secure the borders. The wars also left their mark on culture. After the Roman victory, many Germanic tribes were brought into the empire as settlers or recruited as soldiers. This intensified the mixing of the two worlds. At the same time, the Marcomanni and their allies remained a constant factor of instability that was to challenge Rome again and again in the centuries that followed. The Marcomannic Wars were thus a foretaste of the great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries. They showed that the Germanic world was no longer just a marginal phenomenon, but a dynamic force that increasingly determined the fate of the Roman Empire. Chapter 13. Migration, Causes and Consequences. The so-called migration of peoples is one of the most significant upheavals in European history. Between the late 4th and 6th centuries AD, numerous Germanic tribes left their ancestral settlement areas and moved across Europe in long waves. This movement shook the Roman Empire to its foundations and ushered in the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages. The causes of the migration of peoples were manifold and cannot be traced back to a single event. A decisive factor was population pressure. The Germanic tribes grew in their settlement areas, which increased the competitive pressure for land, livestock, and resources. Added to this was the attractiveness of the Roman Empire, which was a worthwhile destination with its fertile provinces, infrastructure, and riches. Another important trigger was the appearance of the Huns in the 4th century. This equestrian people, originating from Central Asia, advanced westwards and put Germanic tribes such as the Goths in distress. Fleeing from the Huns, many Germanic tribes sought refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire. This began a movement that was soon almost unstoppable. The Visigoths under their leader Alaric are a well-known example. Originally located east of the Danube, they asked to be admitted to the Roman Empire in 376 AD. But poor care and mistreatment by Roman officials soon led to uprisings. In 378, they defeated a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople and killed Emperor Valens, a shock that revealed the vulnerability of Rome. Later, the Visigoths moved on to Italy and even plundered Rome itself in 410 under Alaric. The Vandals also went on a journey. They first moved through Gaul and Spain before crossing over to North Africa in the early 5th century. There, they founded a kingdom with Carthage as its center and became a maritime power that severely affected Rome. In 455, the Vandals plundered Rome, an event that still resonates today in the term vandalism. The Ostrogoths, on the other hand, later moved to Italy, where they established a powerful empire under Theodoric the Great, which temporarily brought stability to post-Roman Italy. Other Germanic groups, such as the Burgundians, Lombards, Suebi, or Angles and Saxons, also looked for new settlement areas. The Anglo-Saxons immigrated to Britain, where they laid the foundation for what would later become England. The Lombards, on the other hand, moved to Italy in the 6th century and founded an empire there that lasted until the early Middle Ages. The consequences of the migration of peoples were profound. The Western Roman Empire disintegrated step by step until it finally ended in 476, when the Germanic military leader Odoacer deposed the last emperor. The Roman order was replaced by Germanic kingdoms, which, on the one hand, tied in with Roman traditions, and on the other hand, established their own structures. At the same time, there was a cultural fusion. Germanic tribes adopted many elements of Roman civilization, language, law, administration, and Christianity, while also bringing in their own traditions. This created a new world that was neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but formed the basis for medieval Europe. The migration of peoples was therefore not simply an invasion of the barbarians, as it is often portrayed in Roman sources. Rather, it was a complex movement of peoples in search of new habitats and permanently changing the face of Europe in the process.
Chapter 14. The Goths, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths. Among all the Germanic tribes that appeared during the migration period, the Goths played a prominent role. They are particularly well documented in the sources and stand like hardly any other tribe for the upheavals that ushered in the end of antiquity. The Goths were divided into two main groups, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths, both of whom went down in history in different ways. The origins of the Goths probably lie in the Baltic Sea region. From there, from the 2nd century AD, they embarked on a migration southwards, which led them to the area north of the Black Sea. There they came up against the borders of the Roman Empire and developed into a powerful neighbor that repeatedly came into conflict with Rome. The Visigoths came under pressure in the 4th century due to the invasion of the Huns. While fleeing, they asked Rome to be admitted to the empire in 376 AD. But the Roman authorities treated them badly, which led to an uprising. In the Battle of Adrianople, 378, the Visigoths inflicted a crushing defeat on the Romans. Emperor Valens fell, and the Roman army suffered heavy losses. After years of wandering, the Visigoths under their king Alaric I, in 410, the famous sack of Rome took place, an event that caused horror throughout the ancient world. Rome had been undefeated for centuries, and the news that the barbarians had conquered the city was seen as a sign of the demise of the old order. Eventually, the Visigoths settled in southern France and later in Spain. There they founded the Visigoth Empire, which began with the capital Toulouse and was later moved to Toledo. This empire existed for several centuries and combined Germanic traditions with Roman heritage. The Visigoths embraced Christianity, first in its Arian form, later in the Catholic faith, and shaped the history of the Iberian Peninsula until its conquest by the Arabs in 711. The Ostrogoths followed a different path. They were also subjugated by the Huns and were dependent on them for a long time. After the collapse of the Hun Empire in the 5th century, they regained their freedom and migrated west. Under their most famous king, Theodoric the Great, they took over the rule of Italy at the beginning of the 6th century. Theodoric's empire is considered an example of the attempt to unite Germanic and Roman traditions. He himself had been educated in Constantinople and knew Roman culture. In Italy, he ruled in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor, but de facto retained power. Under his rule, Italy experienced a period of relative stability, in which Roman administration and Germanic warrior tradition coexisted. Theodoric tried to unite Romans and Goths in a kind of double society, a difficult undertaking, but one that fell apart after his death. The empires of the Goths exemplified how Germanic tribes filled the vacuum left by the decline of the Roman Empire. They took over not only territories, but also administration, culture, and religion. In doing so, they were at the beginning of the new epoch that led Europe into the Middle Ages. The Goths were therefore not just barbarians plundering through the empire, but active shapers of a new world. Its history reflects the transition from Roman antiquity to the Germanic kingdoms, a time in which old and new, Rome and Germania, pagan tradition and Christianity intertwined.
Chapter 15. The Vandals and Their Wanderings. The Vandals belonged to those Germanic tribes that left a particularly impressive mark on history during the migration period. Originally from Central Europe, they undertook a long migration that took them from the Vistula regions via Gaul and Spain to North Africa. There, they founded an empire that severely affected Rome and became notorious in ancient sources. The origins of the Vandals lie in the area between the Oder and Vistula rivers. In the course of the population movements of the 4th century, they joined other tribes and began their migration westwards. Their passage through Gaul in the early 5th century was particularly significant. Together with Suevi and Alans, they crossed the frozen Rhine in 406 AD, an event that had the effect of a thunderclap in the Roman provinces. From there, they plundered through Gaul and finally reached Spain. In Spain, the Vandals initially established themselves in various regions. Two main groups were formed, the Asdingers and the Silingers. But the pressure of the Visigoths, who acted against them as federati on behalf of Rome, forced the Vandals to move on. Under their king Genseric, they dared to take a bold step in 429. They crossed over the Strait of Gibraltar to North Africa with their entire people. North Africa was one of the richest provinces of the Roman Empire, breadbasket, trading center, and strategically important. Within a few years, the Vandals conquered large parts of the region and made Carthage their capital in 439. In doing so, they had not only found a new habitat, but also gained control of the western Mediterranean. The Vandal Empire in North Africa was remarkably organized. Genseric ruled strictly, but successfully. The Vandals took over Roman structures, maintained a fleet, and became a naval power that could threaten even Rome. In 455, they sacked the Eternal City, an event that left a deep impression. The term vandalism is derived from it to this day, although it does not do justice to the historical Vandals. The Vandals differed religiously from the Roman population. Like many other Germanic tribes, they initially professed Arianism, a form of Christianity that deviated from the Catholic faith. This led to tensions with the indigenous population of North Africa, which was largely Catholic. Genseric and his successors persecuted the Catholic Church, sometimes ruthlessly, which contributed to internal conflicts. Despite their power, the Vandals were not permanently stable. Their empire remained militarily strong, but politically and socially vulnerable. When the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian II, when his policy of reconquest began in the 6th century, the Vandals were a central target. In 533–34, the Eastern Roman general Belisarius landed in North Africa and defeated the Vandals in 2 decisive battles. The Vandal Empire collapsed, and North Africa became part of the Byzantine Empire again. With the fall of the Vandal Empire, the Vandals disappeared from history as an independent people. But their migration and empire in North Africa show how far-reaching the movements of the Germanic tribes were and how much they changed the geopolitical order of late antiquity. The Vandals are an example of how Germanic groups appeared not only as destroyers but also as new rulers. They brought down old structures but at the same time created new ones. Their empire was a link between antiquity and the Middle Ages, even if it only lasted for just under a century. Chapter 16. The Burgundians and Lombards. In addition to Goths and Vandals, the Burgundians and Lombards are also among the Germanic tribes that left lasting traces in European history during the migration period. Both groups went their rise on very different paths, but their empires decisively shaped the political map of the early Middle Ages. The Burgundians probably had their origins in the Baltic Sea region, possibly on the island of Bornholm, which is referred to in ancient sources as Burgundarholm. From there, they migrated south and settled on the Upper Rhine in the 4th century. There, they soon came into conflict with Rome, but were also integrated into the empire as federati. In the 5th century, the Burgundians founded a kingdom in the area of today's Worms. This empire has not only become historically significant, but also immortal in literary terms. The Burgundians play a central role in the legends about the Nibelungs. But their first empire fell when they were almost destroyed by Hunnic troops on behalf of Rome in 436. Nevertheless, the Burgundians recovered. They settled further south in the Rhone Valley and founded a new empire there with the capital Lyon. This Burgundian empire developed into an important power factor in the West. It combined Germanic traditions with Roman structures and was a link between cultures. The Burgundians adopted Christianity early on and were in close contact with their neighbors. Her empire was finally absorbed into the emerging Frankish Empire in the 6th century, but her name lives on to this day in the French region of Burgundy. The Lombards took a different path. They came from the Elbe region and initially appeared in the sources as a relatively insignificant tribe. In the course of the migration of peoples, they moved south and finally reached the Danube region. There, they grew into a significant power. However, the Lombards played their decisive role in the 6th century when they invaded Italy under King Alboin. The Western Roman Empire had already fallen, and Italy was weakened after the Gothic Wars under Eastern Roman rule. The Lombards took advantage of the situation and founded their own empire with centers in Pavia and later in northern Italy. The Lombard Empire was a formative factor in Italy for over 2 centuries. It was not territorially unitary, but consisted of a kingdom in the north and various duchies in the south, such as Spoleto and Benevento. The Lombards were often in conflict with the papacy and the Byzantines, but at the same time had a lasting influence on the culture and society of Italy. Religiously, they were first pagans, later, like many other Germanic tribes, Arians. Over time, however, they turned to the Catholic faith, which facilitated their integration into the Romance world. The end of the Lombard Empire came in 774, when Charlemagne invaded Italy and defeated the Lombard king Desiderius. The empire was incorporated into the Frankish Empire, but the Lombards left clear traces in Italian history. The name Lombardy still commemorates her today. Burgundians and Lombards exemplify the diversity of Germanic developments. While some were absorbed into Western France, others shaped Italy and created an empire that became the engine of new political orders. Both stand for the transitional period between antiquity and the Middle Ages, in which Germanic kingdoms replaced the Roman order and created new structures.
Chapter 17. The Anglo-Saxons and the British Isles. The history of the Anglo-Saxons is one of the most exciting chapters of the Germanic past because it marks the beginning of England as an independent sphere of culture and power. While Goths, Vandals, and Lombards founded new empires on the European mainland, A profound upheaval took place in the British Isles that changed the face of the region for centuries. The origins of the Anglo-Saxons lie on the mainland, in the regions of today's northern Germany, Denmark, and North Holland. Various tribes lived there, such as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who were later collectively referred to as Anglo-Saxons. From the 5th century onwards, they began to settle in the British Isles. The background to these migrations was the weakness of Britain after the withdrawal of the Roman troops. Since the 1st century AD, Britain had been a province of the Roman Empire, protected by legions and fortified borders. But at the beginning of the 5th century, the Romans withdrew their soldiers to deal with other crises in the empire. This left the province defenseless against attacks by Picts from Scotland and Irish tribes. The local Celtic Roman population sought help and turned to Germanic warriors from the mainland. At first, the Saxons and Angles probably came as mercenaries, but soon they were followed by entire peoples who settled in Britain. The aid turned into a conquest that profoundly changed the country. The Anglo-Saxons displaced the Celtic population in many regions or pushed them to the outskirts: Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. New kingdoms emerged in the conquered territories, which gradually shaped the image of Britain. Among the most famous were Kent, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. Culturally, the Anglo-Saxons brought their language, their religion, and their social structures with them. Old English, the precursor to today's English, developed from their dialects. Archaeological finds, such as the famous ship tomb of Sutton Hoo, show that they developed a rich culture in which warriorism, trade, and religion were closely intertwined. At first, the Anglo-Saxons were pagans who worshipped their Germanic gods. But from the late 6th century onwards, Christianization began, triggered by missionaries such as Augustine of Canterbury, whom Pope Gregory the Great sent to England. This process was not uniform, but in many small steps, depending on the kingdom and ruler. Christianity connected the islands more closely with the rest of Europe and led to a cultural heyday which was reflected in Anglo-Saxon art, literature, and legal tradition. However, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms remained divided among themselves. Again and again there were fights for supremacy. Nevertheless, they laid the foundations for a united England that was to emerge in the 9th and 10th centuries. The importance of the Anglo-Saxons lies in the fact that they led Britain out of the Roman Celtic tradition and created a new identity. They brought Germanic language and culture to the islands, fused them with native influences, and thus founded the independent development of England. Just as the Vandals in North Africa, the Goths in Italy, or the Lombards in Lombardy shaped their empires, the Anglo-Saxons formed the foundation for one of the most influential nations in European history, a legacy that continues to have an impact today. Chapter 18: The Transition to the Early Middle Ages. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 and the establishment of Germanic kingdoms in almost all parts of the former empire, a new era began, the Early Middle Ages. This transition was not a sudden break, but a centuries-long process in which Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions merged with each other. The Germanic tribes had occupied large parts of Europe in the course of the migration period. The Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths and later the Lombards in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa, the Burgundians in Gaul, and the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. But the most powerful and enduring empire was created by the Franks, who built a strong kingdom under the Merovingians and eventually became the dominant power in Western Europe. The transition to the early Middle Ages was characterized by continuity and change at the same time. On the one hand, the Germanic tribes adopted numerous elements of Roman culture. They used Roman administrative structures, appointed Roman officials, and continued to enforce Roman law. The Latin language and script were also preserved and formed the basis for administration, church, and education. On the other hand, the Germanic tribes brought in their own traditions. Their tribal society, their concepts of law, and their warrior culture shaped the new kingdoms. Instead of the centralized administration of Rome, dominions arose that were strongly characterized by personal ties between the king and his followers. Loyalty and fidelity played a greater role than abstract laws or institutions. Christianity played a central role in the transition to the early Middle Ages. While the Roman Empire had been officially Christian since the 4th century, many Germanic tribes were initially pagans or Arians. But little by little, Catholic Christianity and the close connection between church and state prevailed. Missionaries, monasteries, and bishops spread the faith among the Germanic peoples. Christianization was associated with a profound cultural change. Monasteries became centers of education and written culture, preserving and passing on ancient knowledge. At the same time, new religious values shaped society's thoughts and actions. Kings were portrayed as Christian rulers who received their power from God. The economy also changed. While the cities fell into disrepair in many places, agriculture remained the most important livelihood. Landlords and feudal ties developed into a new organizational model that was to shape the coming centuries. The transition to the early Middle Ages was therefore neither the end of civilization, as it was portrayed in history books for a long time, nor a completely new beginning. Rather, a new order emerged from the interplay of Roman heritage, Germanic culture, and Christian religion. This mixture formed the foundation for medieval Europe. In this process, the Germanic tribes were not just strangers who destroyed the Roman Empire. They became heirs to Rome and designers of a new world that left its mark on the modern age.
Chapter 19. The Germanic Tribes in the Mirror of Roman Sources. Our knowledge about the Germanic tribes comes to a large extent from the reports of Roman authors. Since the Germanic tribes themselves initially had no written culture, we in antiquity are almost exclusively dependent on the representations of their neighbors. These sources are valuable, but also problematic because they reflect less the Germanic tribes themselves than the Roman view of them. One of the earliest and most important authors was Gaius Julius Caesar. In his Commentari de Bello Gallico, he describes the Germanic tribes in connection with his campaigns in Gaul in the 1st century BC. For Caesar, the Germanic tribes were wild, warlike, and uncivilized peoples who were characterized by special bravery but also by cruelty. His descriptions had a political purpose. They were intended to make his own achievements appear all the greater and justify his campaigns. Another central work comes from Tacitus, who wrote the treatise Germania around 98 AD. Tacitus described the customs and traditions of the Germanic tribes in detail. In doing so, he painted an ambivalent picture. On the one hand, he portrayed the Germanic peoples as simple, brave, and morally upright peoples who, in contrast to the decadent Romans, still embodied original virtues. On the other hand, they were also dangerous barbarians for him, who posed a threat to the borders of the empire. Later, in modern times, the Germania was used by many as a source for an idealized image of the Germanic peoples, often in a politically problematic way. Other Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder, Strabo, or Dio Cassius completed the picture. They reported on Germanic tribes, their struggles, their lifestyle, and their religion. The Germanic tribes were often a projection surface for Roman ideas, either as noble savages who made the Romans aware of their moral weaknesses, or as a barbaric danger that had to be fought. The reports of the battles between Romans and Germanic tribes are particularly vivid. For example, Velleius Paterculus described the Battle of Varus and emphasized the role of Arminius. Later historians such as Ammianus Marcellinus gave insights into the battles of the late empire against the invading Germanic peoples. Archaeological finds have confirmed many things, but also corrected some things. Excavations showed that the Germanic tribes were by no means as primitive as some Romans portrayed them. They had differentiated social structures, developed crafts, and extensive trade networks. Nevertheless, the Roman view remains an indispensable part of our knowledge.
Germanic history in antiquity is therefore always a mirror of two perspectives: the tribe's own development on the one hand and Rome's perception on the other. Without the Roman sources, we would only have a fragmentary picture. But with them, we often see the Germanic tribes through a lens that contained admiration, fear, and arrogance at the same time. The Roman image of the Germanic tribes not only shaped antiquity, but also continued to have an effect into modern times. The Germania of Tacitus, for example, was rediscovered in the Middle Ages and later served nationalists as evidence of a supposedly original purity of the Germanic peoples. This shows that these sources are not only historical testimonies, but have also been repeatedly instrumentalized politically.
Chapter 20. Aftermath. Image of the Germanic tribes in the Middle Ages, modern times, and modernity. The Germanic tribes disappeared over the centuries as independent peoples, as they were absorbed into the new kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. But the image of the Germanic tribes lived on, in stories, myths, literature, and later also in historiography. This image changed considerably, depending on the spirit of the times, political interests, and cultural background. In the Middle Ages, the Germanic tribes came alive mainly in legends and heroic songs. Stories such as the Nibelungenlied or the Edda took up motifs from Germanic mythology and tribal history, but combined them with Christian ideas. Arminius, the victor of the Battle of Varus, remained known, but did not play a central role. Instead, many regions remembered their own tribal heroes, such as the Franks remembered Clovis or the Saxons remembered Witikind. In the Renaissance and Humanism, the image of the Germanic tribes came to the fore again through the rediscovery of the writings of Tacitus. His Germania was reread in the 15th century and served scholars to research the origins of the European peoples. Especially in German-speaking countries, people began to see their own ancestors in the Germanic tribes. In the 19th century, the image of the Germanic tribes took on a new, often exaggerated meaning. In the time of nationalism, the Germanic tribes became symbolic figures of a supposedly ancient, pure, and heroic German nation. Arminius, now usually called Hermann, was glorified as a hero of freedom. The Hermann Monument near Detmold, inaugurated in 1875, is an expression of this national consciousness. Poets, historians, and artists took up the Germanic image to strengthen identity and pride. Romanticism also contributed to idealization. The old myths, gods, and heroes were rediscovered and celebrated as an expression of an original, nature-loving culture. Wagner, for example, drew on Germanic material in his operas and made them a central part of his art. But the Germanic image was also misused. In the 20th century, especially under Nazi socialism, the Germanic tribes were glorified as an indigenous people and instrumentalized for racist ideologies. The Nazis portrayed them as the ancestors of a superior Aryan race and used archaeological finds and myths for their propaganda. This distorted image of the Germanic tribes contributed to a disastrous ideologization of history. After 1945, a critical reassessment began. Historians have sought to look at the Germanic peoples beyond nationalistic distortions and to explore their actual lives, culture, and role in antiquity. Archaeology, linguistics, and interdisciplinary studies help to paint a more differentiated picture. The Germanic tribes as a diverse tribal group that was in exchange with Rome and cultivated its own traditions. Today, the Germanic tribes are no longer seen as a unified people, but as a heterogeneous tribal community, whose history was marked by migration, contact with neighbors, and internal diversity. Nevertheless, their image lives on in many areas: in pop culture, in fantasy literature, in films and games that take up their myths and warrior traditions. The aftermath of the Germanic tribes shows how strongly past and memory are intertwined. They were real historical actors, but at the same time, they were always a projection screen for later generations. From the barbarian image of the Romans to the heroic image of the nationalists to modern research, the Germanic tribes remained a part of the European identity, the interpretation of which changed depending on the era.